Hello and welcome to Model Kit Stuff, and today's video we're going to focus on brush painting with ICM paints. How does it perform as a brush paint, and how do we get the best out of the paint if we're going to use it for brush painting? Hello and welcome. Yes, as part of our ongoing assessment of ICM paints, today we're having a look at how they perform under basic brush painting. So I have my mule. I've got some of it primed, as you can see, and I've got some of it unprimed, and we're going to test both. And I've gone with a couple of bright colours out of the 80 colour set so that we can clearly see what happens with them. In the last video we established there was some thinners that worked well with these paints, the Humbrol and the Vallejo thinner, but we also established that water, which is what the manufacturer says can be used as a thinner, was probably the best out of the bunch for thinning the paints. So with that in mind, I thought what we'd do is take it to the next step and see what happens when we try and apply these paints for brush painting. Now on the box, on the side of the box, it makes a statement about these paints as being brush paint ready, that they need thinning to 40 and 60% for airbrush, and that you need to prime for airbrush. Now the fact that they point out that you need to prime for airbrush suggests that maybe you don't need to prime if you're brush painting. So we're going to explore all of that in this video. Right, so I've given both of these paints a good shake. They're unopened, so haven't done any mechanical mixing of these paints. So let's start with the purple one, which is called Deep Purple. Okay, so it's a nice vibrant colour actually, and what we're going to do is we're going to put some of that into our palette here. Now it's going to be warm today, so I'm doing this fairly early in the morning, so I'm still at about an average room temperature currently in here. There we go. So as you can see, the paint is quite thick, but they do suggest that it's ready to go from the bottle. When we look at what it says on the edge of the box, it says paint is prepared for a brush. So let's have a play on this mule. So we've cleaned one wing and we've left this sort of ordinarily handled. So I think the kit would have been washed when I first built it up, but I don't remember. So this is unthinned Deep Purple from ICM. So I'm just going to paint up a little section and see how this goes on. Okay, although it's gone on okay, the paint is just too thick. So I would suggest that it needs thinning right from the off when you're brush painting. So we're going to thin today using just water because we know that works quite well. So we're going to put just a couple of drops of water in and we'll thin this down. Now if you remember on the thinning video, it didn't need a lot of water to make a difference. And then if we wipe it on the side, we can get our speed. So that suggests it's still too thick. But we'll give that a go. Ordinarily, I would say that was too thick. Can you see how slowly it's moving? But for brush painting, you can sometimes get away with that. So let's just try that on the next section. I'll leave a little gap. Okay, that's a lot better because I'm not getting brush strokes, but because the paint is thinned, you're going to have to build up some layers of paint, but that is normal when you're brush painting. That's the normal approach. The key thing here is we're not getting any brush strokes in the paint. So yeah, that's going down much better. Now this is a matte paint. We can see that from this one drying off. We're getting no separation, which is good. And the other thing that I've noticed as we put this down is that we had no problems with surface tension, which you quite often get with an acrylic paint. Now, just out of interest, let's just put some paint down on this side here that we've cleaned and see if that improves how this works. Now, I admit this isn't overly scientific, but what I'm going to say is it's not really making much difference, which means the paint has handled an unclean surface. So this is plastic that I've handled many, many times that'll have grease off my fingers and all that sort of stuff on there. And the paint has handled it well. It hasn't separated, it hasn't fisheyed, and we've not had any issues with surface tension. So that paint is behaving as I would expect for the viscosity that I've got in my palette. So yeah, that's really, really interesting. Let's see what the difference is when we try it on a primed area. So I'm just going to paint a little section. So there we go on a primed area, and what you're immediately seeing is that this this paint is going to need a few layers, and you're going to have to choose your primer carefully because as your paint's thinner, a dark primer such as this is going to show through more easily. But that has gone on really, really well. Yeah, that has gone on really, really nicely, actually. So we just need that to dry. Now, one of the downsides of thinning it with water is the drying time slows down, which is a downside for me right now. But in ordinary conditions, when it's warm, that can be an advantage. It stops our palette drying out so quickly. So what I want to do now, while all these paints are drying off, is I'm just going to do a little scratch test on this. So some acrylic paints can have an issue with scratching off. And it tends to be the water-based ones. So if you think about Tamiya's acrylic paint, which isn't really an acrylic because it's got solvent in it, that's much harder on a non-primed surface than a Vallejo paint, which is notorious. So I'm going to start by just giving it a rub with my thumb. So let me just make sure I've got a good grip of this. So if you'd painted it, not sealed it, and you were handling it a lot, well, that seems to be surviving the rub test. So yeah, no noticeable paint on my finger. So that's how I'd expect it to primarily be treated. So I would say a Vallejo paint probably would have started rubbing doing that. Because we've not left it to dry long enough and we've not sealed it. But that is behaving really, really nicely. Okay, so let's try the fingernail test now, and we're just going to give it a bit of a scratch with my fingernail. Yeah, so you can see there that that's coming off. So if you're painting directly onto an unprimed surface, you are going to need to seal this before you put masking tape down or you do anything else on top of it. So yeah, in fact, let's do a little masking tape test, shall we? So this masking tape, it's not Tamiya tape, it's Humbrol tape, and it's a bit tackier than the Tamiya one. So let's just see what happens. I'm going to give it a good press down. Yeah, it's definitely lifted some of that paint. I'd say the paint is standing up to it quite well. It could be that was just the paint dust from scratching it, to be honest. We'll further explore that in a minute, I think. So the paint's dried on this side. So that was the unthinned. This is thinned. It's still damp on this side. This is thinned. So I'm just going to do the same here. Yeah, I'd say the paint is adhering really, really well. It's performing nicely, actually. So I'm just going to rub the edge because that's where you'd sometimes find it coming off. And there is some evidence that if you rub hard enough and prolonged enough, you can rub it off, but it's clinging on in there. It doesn't like the idea that I'm trying to remove it. Right, so let's do a bit of a test on this one with masking tape as well. I'll give it a good press in. I'm even putting my fingernail in where we've got the panel line. There we go. So that's as pressed on as hard as I can go. Yeah. So it has taken some paint off here. So it does need sealing, but this is on an unprimed surface. So let's see how she gets on a primed surface. So while that's drying, let's mix up some yellow paint because I'm interested to see how well the yellow paint performs, because it's notoriously difficult to paint with yellow. Right, mix my yellow up, and what I want to do is some of the same tests that we've already done. adhesion and stuff like that. But I want to do also a bit of a technique test here. So I always say when brush painting that the method I tend to run with is thick, thin, finished. Three layers generally, quite often 4 layers, where you are, it depends on the colour in reality, where you're putting your thickest layer of paint down first, then a slightly thinner layer of paint, and then an even thinner layer of paint, and you might need to do that a couple of times, like I say. Why do I do it that way? Because I think that's the best way of preserving the detail and removing brush strokes. So what I've done is I've put a section down that I have painted unthinned. So that's going to be my thickest. And I have just thinned the paint with water like we've done with the purple to a consistency that I think is right for brush painting. So if you just look at the speed of that, that's right for brush painting for me. You just want it a tad thinner maybe for an airbrush, but you might get away with it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this down because I want to see how many layers of paint we need to put down to get something that looks nice and solid, and you've got basically no modulation in there. Now I've got to say, just basically thinned, and I'm using a small brush, so I'm almost deliberately putting brush strokes in, because if we'd used a wider brush we'd get better coverage. First thing I'm doing is I'm painting my style, which is to go over the painted area a few times, which you can't do with Tamiya. It's why I dislike Tamiya paint so much, or their acrylic paint so much, because you can't keep going over it. You put the layer down, you've got to let it dry, because otherwise if you keep going over it, it collects. And what I'm seeing is this paint is behaving beautifully. It really, really is. So we've done a section there, and given that this is a yellow, and my comment is it's a lovely yellow for things like propeller tips, you know, they call it deep yellow. It's a sort of a signal yellow. It's very, very nice. Yeah, very, very nice. So we're going to let that dry because we want to put some more layers down, and we've got to make sure it's dry. I don't want to be taking the paint off as we put more on. But that hasn't caused me any problems with the detail. That's going to shrink in nicely. Again, this is another matte paint, but that yellow, that would look perfect on a Luftwaffe aircraft, wouldn't it? On one of your ME-109s underneath the engine. That's just a nice yellow. I like that. So we're going to leave that to dry for a minute or two, and then I'm going to do another section here on the fuselage. And what I want to do is just use this for scratch testing. So is this yellow paint going to behave the same as the purple paint? Because that's another test. Do the paints behave differently? Now I do have some different paints within this set, metallics and clears, and we will try those separately to see how they behave. I really like this paint, actually. It's going down really nice. Now, while we're waiting for this to dry, we do have this purple paint that we put down earlier. So we can see one coat, and it's fairly translucent. So I'm going to put down a second coat. Now look how solid that's starting to look. You're not seeing brush marks. It's shrinking into the detail nicely. That's 2 coats. So that makes me hopeful for what's going to happen with this yellow. Okay, that's dried off sufficiently to allow me to put a second coat down. So I'm going to, I haven't thinned this any heavier. What I've done is I've washed the brush, so the brush was a bit damp, and I've blotted it out so that it's damp rather than wet, and then we've re-agitated the paint, mixed it in the palette. So just going to go, this time we're going to go across. So little secret for you here, it's just like sanding. If you're painting opposite directions, you remove any brush strokes more quickly, but this is it's not always possible to do that, but wherever possible, this is what I try and do as a painting technique for brush painting. There we go. Now I have put a second coat on that one. Again, that was the same thickness as this one, so slightly thinned with water. So that is my second coat. Now we'll do another second coat on here for exactly the same reason. I want to do some tests on that. Now my paint is starting to thicken up a little bit in the palette, but it's a relatively warm day here. It's about 17, 18 degrees already this morning. And I have got it spread out in quite a big palette to make it more visible. If I'd put it in a smaller palette where it could pool, it would be drying more slowly because we'd have less surface area exposed to the air. But right, let that dry off and then I'll come back to you. Right, so I have further thinned this paint with another drop of water. And this is now what I would consider to be airbrush consistency. So how I'd want to thin it down for use on the airbrush. I've just given the first section a third coat. So this is the one where we went neat from the bottle, unthinned. Then we thinned it down to the brush painting consistency that I would prefer. And I've just gone over it with this further airbrush thinned thickness of paint. Same with that, but that's a little bit irrelevant because that's just for an adhesion test. And the reason why I don't want to do an adhesion test on these is because in another video I want to varnish these and see how the varnishes perform. So this is now the third paint level, and if you remember what I said, thickest, thin, thinnest, then we're doing the thinnest level now. And again, in the opposite direction to how we applied it last time. So the reason for doing that is your brush strokes are going in a different direction, so you're not compounding thick and thin levels of paint that the brush strokes have made. There we go. Now I can tell from that immediately that that is going to need a fourth coat, and I'm rushing this a little bit because, well, to be honest with you, I'm trying to go out, but that, you can see the difference. I'm going to let that dry, and that's just 2 coats there. and you can see it's not fully dried. But painting this bottom section with a third coat, we're going to see a difference in the paint, in the colour saturation. That's definitely going to need another one. So this one here, the purple, that's had 3 coats, and you could get away with that depending on what you're doing, to be honest. So it's looking like you're going to be between 3 and 4 coats depending on the colour. Yellow, light white, notoriously hard to paint. Purple, not so bad, and it's gone down really quite well. So I suspect that your browns, your greens, your blues are going to be 3 coats when brush painting, and your more translucent colours like this yellow is probably going to need 4. But we're not losing any of the detail in any of this. Obviously, airbrushing will make more difference, and we'll do airbrushing separately. But right now, I'm going to leave that to dry, and then I'll come back to you, and we'll see how we're getting on. So this has now had 4 coats. This bit here above the line has had 3 coats. This has had 3 coats, and if you remember, we started with this unthinned, and actually that's the one that's turned out the best in terms of finish on a dark primer. Normally you wouldn't put yellow on a dark primer, you'd be using a white primer or something like that. But so actually I think in the main for these colours you're going to be somewhere between 3 to 4 coats when brush painting. Now this purple's only had 2. To make it feel more solid, I'd go for 3, but if we'd had a lighter primer, a paler grey primer for example, we may well have got away with 2 on this colour. So as a betting man, I'm gonna say probably an average of 3 coats, sometimes 4. Right, now then, this has all been drying for 24 hours, so everything that you'd seen so far I did yesterday morning, and we've left it to dry. So I'm now going to do this masking test. So there is no varnish or anything like that on here. It's completely just the paint gone down and nothing more. And we'll go in and press it in more than you'd normally do, just to be extreme and see what happens. So there we go. Yeah, there's no issues there. It performs really well under masking tape, and like I say, this masking tape is tackier, has more adhesive than the Tamiya tape. So yeah. So if you allow it to dry thoroughly, you're not going to have any issues with masking it. So that is really nice. So far, this paint has performed really well, hasn't it? Oh, knock that off. Yeah, no issues at all. So, my conclusion so far, ICM paints, we've taken a look at them. I actually prefer the fact that we get them in a bottle rather than a dropper bottle. Dropper bottles cause all sorts of problems because you've got to thin the paints and all sorts of stuff. So I prefer this bottle offering to a dropper bottle. So that's a plus for me, at least. The paints seem to be nice and smooth, and they all seem to be fairly consistent from the ones I've looked at. The colours seem to hold up well to brush painting. So far, so good. And they seem to hold up well, even when you've not clear coated them to masking tape. So Next thing we'll do in the next video is we'll put some of the ICM varnish over it and see how that comes out. So I'm probably going to put another couple of colours on here so we can have a look at the range of colours with the varnish. So I might put a clear colour on and a metallic on to see what happens. But yeah, so far I am loving these ICM paints. So we'll do some varnish next and then we'll have a look at airbrushing. Now, one last thing to say just before we go is this tailplane here that is white. That is also an ICM paint. It went onto this dark grey primer and that's had 4 coats as well, and I think that looks great. So just to prove the point, 2 of the most difficult colours to paint, not a problem really. So hope that was informative. Please look out for more about looking and testing at ICM paints, and I will see you very soon. Enjoy your modelling. Bye for now.